A cold front had rolled across Colorado that week. On the morning of October 5, 2012, the streets of Westminster were still, the light was pale, and a 10-year-old girl stepped out of her front door for the short walk she had already made hundreds of times before. She never finished it. This is the story of a child who did everything right, a community that moved heaven and earth to find her, and a predator who was hiding in plain sight. Viewer discretion is advised. Jessica Ridgeway lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood of Westminster, Colorado. She shared a home with her mom, her grandma, and her aunt. Her parents were separated, and her dad lived out of state, but she had a strong bond with both of them. At school, teachers described Jessica as the kind of student every classroom needs. She was cheerful, eager to help, the first to raise her hand, the first to welcome a new kid. She loved dance routines and TV shows, loved animals, loved learning. She was 10, and her world was exactly the size it was supposed to be. Her walk to school was short, simple, and familiar. She would leave home, walk a few blocks to Chelsea Park, meet her friends, and together they would continue on to Witt Elementary. It was a routine everyone around her trusted. That morning, Jessica woke herself up with an alarm clock she had proudly asked for so she could be more independent. She watched some TV, ate a granola bar, helped her mom peel an orange to take to school. Then she put on her thick winter coat, said goodbye, and stepped out into the cold. She never reached the park. Her friends waited at their usual spot, then eventually continued on without her, assuming she was running late. At 10 years old, you do not automatically think the worst. Jessica did not arrive for class. Hours passed. Eventually, the school called her mother, but Jessica's mom worked night shifts and had gone to sleep after watching her daughter walk out the door. Her phone rang. The call went to voicemail. It was not until late afternoon that her mother woke up and heard the message that Jessica had never made it to school. At first, she assumed there had been some misunderstanding, some mix-up in attendance. She drove to the park, to the school, to friends' houses. No one had seen Jessica. That evening, she called the police and reported her only child missing. Investigators quickly realized this was not a simple case of a child wandering off. The time window was too large, the circumstances too unusual. By that night, they were treating it as a likely abduction. An Amber Alert was issued. Within hours, what had begun as one family's nightmare became a community-wide emergency. More than 50 officers and agents, including the FBI, converged on Westminster. Firefighters brought in thermal imaging equipment. When helicopters could not get airborne safely because of icing conditions, searchers relied on floodlights and boots on the ground. Volunteers poured into the Westview Recreation Center to sign up. Parents who had never met Jessica lined up to join grid searches through parks, ravines, and open fields. By 2 in the morning, authorities had to send volunteers home with instructions to return at first light. When dawn came, the search effort exploded in size. Teams went door to door. Yards, sheds, and garages were checked. Creeks and wooded areas were combed. Cars entering and leaving the neighborhood were photographed. Hundreds of DNA samples were collected as investigators cast as wide a net as they could. Purple ribbons, Jessica's favorite color, began appearing everywhere, around trees, on mailboxes, on fences. The town was trying to turn itself into a message board that said one thing: bring her home. Back inside the family home, officers found a school notebook on Jessica's desk. On one page, she had written a simple personal safety rule to herself about not playing alone at the park and being careful around strangers. She had been cautious. She had understood the dangers the way a 10-year-old can. That only left 2 explanations. Either someone she trusted had approached her that morning, or a complete stranger had acted with speed and precision, leaving no chance for her to react or get away. Days passed. The search only intensified. More than 1,000 leads came in. Multiple agencies coordinated around the clock. Jessica's parents were fully cooperative and were eventually ruled out as suspects. Investigators began to fear what they already knew, that this was the work of a stranger, the rare nightmare scenario that every parent dreads but most will never face. About a week after Jessica disappeared, a man in the nearby community of Superior noticed a backpack left in open view near a road. He did not immediately connect it to the Amber Alert. The bag contained a water bottle, some clothes, and a keychain with the name Jessica. He posted about it locally, and someone else realized what it might be. Police were notified. For Jessica's family, the discovery of her backpack was a painful kind of hope. If someone had discarded her belongings, maybe it meant she had escaped and the abductor had simply dumped what could identify her. Maybe she was still out there, but that hope did not last long. Soon after, maintenance workers in the suburb of Arvada noticed a heavy bag near a roadside area not far from a park. Police were called. Inside, they found human remains. Forensic testing confirmed what everyone had been dreading. The remains belonged to 10-year-old Jessica Ridgeway. Investigators did not release graphic details, but what they could share publicly made it clear that the person responsible had shown extreme cruelty and a disturbing level of planning. The search for Jessica became a mission for justice. At this point, law enforcement acknowledged something terrible and rare: a predator who abducts and kills a child, then attempts to dispose of the body in such a calculated way, is almost always someone who has offended or tried to offend before. They began to look backward as well as forward. 4 months earlier, on Memorial Day, a woman jogging near Kettner Lake had been attacked from behind. Her attacker tried to press a cloth soaked in chemicals over her face and drag her off the path. She fought back and managed to escape. DNA from that attempted abduction had been preserved. When it was compared with the evidence from Jessica's case, the results were clear. The same person was responsible, but that person was still faceless. With a child killer on the loose, investigators and profilers turned to the community for help in a different way. They asked people to look not only for strangers, but for change. They urged residents to think about anyone whose behavior had shifted suddenly after the disappearance. Someone who might have become withdrawn, agitated, obsessive, changed their appearance, hidden or cleaned a car, or begun making unusual excuses. Statistics suggested the offender was almost certainly someone's relative, someone's neighbor, someone who lived close enough to know the area and feel confident abducting a child there. In other words, he was hidden not by distance, but by familiarity. Eventually, a small but important clue emerged. Police released a photograph of a wooden cross associated with the crime scene. One neighbor recognized it. She connected it to a teenager who lived nearby, a 17-year-old named Austin Sigg. She also knew he had an unhealthy fascination with death and decay. Investigators spoke with him and collected a DNA sample. He claimed he had been asleep at home when Jessica disappeared. His name joined a long list of people who had been questioned and swabbed. With thousands of tips coming in and hundreds of samples to process, not every piece of evidence was handled perfectly. The envelope that was supposed to return his DNA results came back empty. It should have been a clear warning that something had gone wrong, but in the chaos of a massive investigation, that absence was misinterpreted as a negative result. For a short time, Austin slipped through the cracks. Then the pressure tightened again. News reports began talking publicly about the DNA link between the attempted abduction of the jogger and the murder of Jessica. That same day, Austin felt physically ill at school. He complained of feeling shaky and overwhelmed. That night, he slept in his mother's bed. The next morning, he told her he had something to confess. She would later describe a horrible intuition, as if she already knew what he was about to say before he spoke. When he confirmed that he was responsible for Jessica's disappearance and death, she collapsed in shock. Then she did something unimaginably difficult and absolutely crucial. She called the police and reported her own son. When officers arrived at the house, Austin did not resist. At the station, he began to talk. He admitted that the failed attack on the jogger had been his first attempt. He had produced his own crude version of an incapacitating chemical. When the woman escaped, instead of deterring him, it pushed him to plan more carefully next time. He told investigators that he had gone out that October morning essentially hunting for a victim. He wanted someone smaller, someone he could overpower easily. He did not know Jessica. He had never spoken to her. She was simply at the park, alone for a moment, making snowballs and waiting for her friends. He watched her. He positioned his Jeep where it would not attract attention. He waited until she stepped into a vulnerable position, then grabbed her, pulled her into the vehicle and drove away before anyone could intervene. From that moment on, Jessica was never seen alive again outside his control. Austin took her to his home. What happened inside those walls in the hours that followed remains partially obscured by his own self-serving account and by the limits of what investigators and courts are willing to describe. What is clear is that he kept her there, that he ultimately killed her, and that he then attempted to conceal his crime by dismembering and scattering her remains. He showed no urgency in calling for help, no panic, no attempt to undo what he had done. Instead, he focused on how to avoid detection. He had studied forensic techniques. He was enrolled in mortuary science. He had spent years consuming increasingly violent material online involving children. To him, Jessica was not a neighbor's child or a 10-year-old with a favorite color and a new alarm clock. She was a target. Thanks to his mother's call, the illusion of control ended. During his interrogation, investigators discovered the earlier error with his DNA sample. A new test was rushed. This time, the match was undeniable. His DNA was on the jogger and on evidence from Jessica's case. Physical evidence from his Jeep, including bindings, supported his confession. Prosecutors charged him as an adult with a long list of serious offenses, including first-degree murder, kidnapping, sexual exploitation of a child, and attempted murder in the jogger case. At first, Austin entered a not guilty plea. His legal team explored the possibility of an insanity defense, highlighting a complicated family background, medical issues at birth, and mental health concerns during adolescence. Experts who reviewed the case, however, noted a crucial point. Whatever difficulties Austin had faced, there was no evidence that he had been abused as a child. He came from a home that, while imperfect, was supportive. He had parents who had tried to get him help when his behavior and interests worried them. His crimes showed planning, patience, and a striking lack of empathy. This was not a sudden loss of control followed by remorse. He had hunted, abducted, killed, and attempted to destroy the evidence. With trial approaching and the community bracing itself to hear every detail replayed in open court, Austin changed his plea. He admitted guilt to multiple charges relating to Jessica and to the jogger he had attacked months earlier. Because he was 17 at the time of the murder, the death penalty was not available. Under Colorado law, the minimum sentence for a juvenile convicted of first-degree murder was life with the possibility of parole after 40 years. The judge did not stop there. For each additional charge, including kidnapping and sexual offenses, the court added more years, stacked consecutively. In total, Austin received life in prison plus 86 years. On paper, there is a theoretical minimum. In reality, he will never leave prison alive. Outside the legal system, the emotional fallout of his actions was much messier. Austin's mother, Mindy, has never once regretted calling the police on her son. She has also never been able to speak to him again. She has said that she cannot risk being lied to, cannot live through his version of events when he has never truly explained why he did what he did. She carries one kind of grief. Jessica's family carries another. Remarkably, Jessica's grandmother has spoken about feeling compassion for Mindy. She has acknowledged that Mindy also lost a child that day, in a very different way. She has said that if it had been allowed in court, she would have hugged her. It is a reminder that in crimes like this, the blast radius extends far beyond victim and offender. The community of Westminster chose not to let Jessica's story end at the roadside where her remains were found. A memorial playground was built and drenched in purple. It includes a custom track ride, a ribbon-themed swing set, and playful touches like knock-knock jokes from her classmates engraved into the equipment. It is a place where children can still laugh and run, in a space that bears her name. Out of her case grew greater awareness about rapid alert systems, including efforts like the Lassie Project, designed to let parents and guardians notify their local community in seconds if a child goes missing. Friends and neighbors organized cheer camps in her honor, knowing that becoming a cheerleader had been one of the things she was most excited to try when she got older. Years later, Jessica's mother gave birth to another daughter, Anna. The family has filled their home with purple, with photographs, with stories. They speak about Jessica openly so that she remains a presence instead of an unmentionable absence. They have been clear about one thing: Anna does not replace Jessica. She expands the family around the empty space her sister left. Jessica's story is, on its surface, about a short walk to school that ended in unimaginable violence, but underneath that, it is also about how thin the line can be between the ordinary and the catastrophic. There was no dangerous city alleyway here, no broken rule, no careless risk, just a routine route through a safe neighborhood where a child who loved school set out to meet her friends. Her family describes their loss as a plate that has been smashed. You can glue the pieces together, but the cracks will always show. No matter how carefully you rebuild, it is never the same object again. True crime often focuses on the monster at the center of the story. In this case, that monster was a teenage boy who spent years feeding a private obsession until he finally turned it into action. But the more important part of the story is not him. It is the 10-year-old who never got to grow up, the mother who had to dial 911 on her own child, the grandmother who found compassion for another grieving parent, the town that wrapped itself in purple and decided that Jessica would be remembered not only for how she died, but for how she lived. In the end, justice for Jessica did not mean erasing what happened. That is impossible. It meant making sure the person who took her would never be free to hurt anyone else, and it meant refusing to let that one act of cruelty define the community she called home.